All right, I'm going to look at Shakespeare and Catholicism. Shakespeare, Catholicism. Is there any relationship? What kind of relationship might there be? Are they connected in some way? Let's take a look and see exactly how Shakespeare relates to and interacts with the Catholicism of his day. Okay, so before we can answer that question, we need to think a little bit about what Catholics actually are. What would be the defining feature of a Catholic? What would make a Catholic a Catholic? What is the one thing that would make a Catholic different from a Protestant? What must there be? All right, there are plenty of differences between Catholics and Protestants, but what is the basic central thing that makes Catholics Catholics different from Protestants? Any ideas? This is the basic difference. Catholics follow the Pope, the Romaho. If they don't follow the Pope, they're not Catholics. It's as simple as that. All right? And if we're talking about Christians in Western Europe, then Protestants are Christians who do not owe allegiance to the Pope. That's the basic difference between them. There are lots of other differences between what Catholics believe and Protestants believe, and just take a look at a few of them. Catholics believe in not only the Bible, but the 1,000 years or so of church tradition that came before the Reformation in the 16th century. And also for Catholics after that, further church traditions that grew up subsequently. Whereas for Protestants, basically the idea was the Bible is the source of truth for Christians. So they followed the idea of sola scriptura in Latin, the Bible as the only source of information about the religious life. And for Catholics, particularly in those days, maybe we wouldn't say it quite so much now, but in the 16th and 17th centuries, justification by works, that you could do things that would justify you to go to heaven. So the things that you did by being a good person or by doing penances so that you showed outwardly through your works, through your deeds, through what you did, that you were a good person, that this would justify you, this would make it possible for you to go to heaven. Whereas Protestants said, none of that, none of what you do on the outside matters. It's your faith inside you. It's your justification by your faith. Sola fide in Latin, faith alone. Nothing else will get you into heaven. Catholics also had the idea of free will, basically, that you were making choices that were going to affect whether you went to heaven or hell in the next life. Whereas Protestants believed the words in the Bible that say that people's names are written into the book of life at the very beginning. So they are predestined. Their fate is already decided. So predestination, especially again for 16th and 17th century Protestants, this was a big point. Catholics also had created a space in between heaven and hell, that they couldn't somehow believe that everybody would just either go to heaven or to hell, but they thought that after death there would be some place where some people would go to be purified, and then later on they would go to heaven. Whereas Protestants said there was only heaven and there was only hell. Connected with this justification by works was penance, that you could do penances. In other words, you could fast. That means you would not eat for a period of time. You could go barefoot. You could punish your body in various ways, including whipping yourself, to express sorrow for the sins that you had committed, for the bad things you'd done. Whereas Protestants said, no, none of this matters. It's how you feel in your heart. You have to repent inside your heart. It's not an outward show of something you do, like not eating or going barefoot or punishing the body in some way. It's what you feel in your heart that is going to make a difference. Catholics would pray to Mary and to the saints, and Protestants would pray to God only. So these would be some of the differences, and there are more, such as offering prayers for the dead, which Catholics would do but Protestants wouldn't. Confessing sins is a Catholic thing. The clergy, the priests, don't marry inside Catholic tradition. Elaborate rituals, pictures, statues and things like that. Saying prayers, the same prayer again and again and again. These are basically Catholic practices, not usually part of Protestant practice. And the idea that Christ really is, his flesh and blood really is in the bread and wine that people take at communion. So these would be some of the kinds of differences. But the basic one would be whether or not they accept the Pope as their leader. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Reformation and how things developed in the 16th century as the Catholic Church was challenged and the Protestant churches started to grow up. Basically what was happening was that over hundreds of years the Catholic Church had developed quite a lot of ideas and things which were not in the Bible and were not part of the way Christianity was practiced during the first few centuries after Christ. And by the time the 16th century came along, which was the century, of course, that Shakespeare was born in, there were quite a lot of traditions that were practiced by the church but not found in the Bible. And one of the more infamous practices, one of the practices that attracted a lot of negative attention, was that of selling pardons and indulgences. And people could actually buy a piece of paper that was supposed to forgive their sins and shorten the amount of time that they would spend in purgatory before they could go to heaven after they died. But even from the time of Chaucer, quite a long time before the Reformation, there were people who could see that the main thing here was to make the church rich. It was a kind of trick which quite a lot of people did not accept. So there was quite a lot of anger because the church was so wealthy and powerful, and this anger was channeled when Martin Luther nailed his list of complaints against the church to the church door at Wittenberg in Germany. And there was a growth of popular protest against the church at this time. So Luther was the first. He had been a monk, an Augustinian monk. He had been obviously a Catholic and a doctor of theology, but he had found things that were wrong with his faith, and he presented them in this way. He didn't himself imagine that he was going to be pushed out of the Catholic Church. He thought that the church would listen to him and change itself, but things went in a different direction. He was the first, and others came afterwards, such as Melanchthon, Calvin, Zwingli. These would be some of the most famous reformers of the 16th century in Europe, and they spoke out against the Catholic Church, and they tried to establish what they felt was a more correct way of practicing the Christian religion. And so various Protestant churches were established, mostly focusing on studying the Bible and what the Bible said, and the earlier Christian writers from the first few centuries after Christ, who were felt to represent the kind of pure faith before the Catholic Church started adding on all its different ideas and developments that were not actually found in the Bible. Okay, so what was happening in England at this time? Well, the Reformation in 16th century England is a kind of, it's really like a pendulum swinging across the 16th century. We're going to start with it with Henry VIII here, and the pendulum is way over on the Catholic side. All right, it was a Catholic country until 1533. Basically, England was a Catholic country, as it had been for hundreds of years before that. But even though Henry VIII was a sincere Catholic, he later on had an argument with the Pope, and we will see that things changed. Before that, however, we can see that Henry was respected very much as a Catholic and was given by the Pope the title Fidei Defensor. Fidei Defensor in Latin means defender of the faith, defender of the Catholic faith, and this title was specially given to Henry by the Pope in 1521, and actually it's still used by the monarch, in our day by Elizabeth II, who we can see on the money that's used. We can see Dei Gratia Regina, meaning that she's Queen by the grace of God. And then we can see those letters FD, Fidei Defensor, defender of the faith. Ironically, not the same faith that the Pope gave Henry the title for. All right, she is a defender of the faith, but it's the Anglican faith, the Eikokokyokai, the Church of England, which is not, strictly speaking, a Catholic church in the sense that it does not owe allegiance to the Pope, although its members will still say that they believe in the Holy Catholic Church in the sense that they believe in a universal Christian church, but they don't owe allegiance to the Pope, which, as we said before, was the basic difference between Catholics and Protestants. So what happened? Why did England change? Mostly it was because Henry VIII wanted, very famously, he wanted to have a divorce. So from 1534 to 1547, when Henry died, the church was in a kind of middle position. Henry wanted a divorce from his Catholic wife, who was a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, whom he'd married many years before. He'd had a daughter, but he wanted a son, and he was sure now that she wouldn't give him a son. She was too old. And so he wanted to divorce her or separate from her, and the Pope would not allow him. So he decided he would separate anyway. And the Pope said, well, in that case, you're not a member of our church anymore. He was excommunicated. He was kicked out from the Catholic Church. So this meant that the Church of England now was going to be controlled by Henry, and it was not going to be, strictly speaking, a Catholic church. It did not follow the Pope in Rome. So what he was going to do was close the monasteries and allow the Bible to be translated into English. The monasteries were a big source of money because there were many monks and nuns in the Shodoing, the monasteries, who really they needed to be paid for, basically. And by letting them or forcing them to leave the monasteries and go out into the world, he freed up a lot of money and also the land that the monasteries were set in. So this land and this money was something that he was able to use to pay as a kind of bribe to the higher level lords, to keep them sweet and to make sure that they followed his policies and so on. And the other thing he did was to allow the Bible to be translated into English. He'd always been against this, and before the separation from Rome and the Pope, he had stopped people from translating the Bible into English. But now really he didn't have all that much choice. He had at least to allow the Bible to be translated into English. But apart from that, the church was more or less in between the Catholic position and the Protestant position. It kept many of the Catholic teachings, but it didn't really accept many of the Protestant teachings, but it had broken away from the Pope, and it had allowed the Bible to be translated into English. So it was in this kind of middle area. And then after 1547, when Henry died, his son became king. Now his son was just a child, really, and he was influenced by his kind of people surrounding him who were protecting him, I suppose, but they kind of guiding him. And between them and him, he became more strongly Protestant. England became more strongly Protestant. The Church of England became more like a Protestant church in other parts of Europe. But he didn't live for very long. And within a few years he was dead, and his sister, his half-sister Mary, became the queen. Now, she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the Catholic queen, whom Henry divorced, and she kept the Catholic religion. So at this time, England went straight back to being a Catholic country, with the Pope, with everything. It just went back to being a Catholic country. But she also didn't live for very long, and her half-sister Elizabeth took over in 1558, leading in the following year to the establishment of the Church of England in a similar way to that of her father. Not quite the same, but rather similar. It was in between Catholic and Protestant. It was a via media in Latin, a middle way. So the Elizabethan settlement of 1559 stabilized the church in this position in between Catholic and Protestant. Again, there was quite a variety. Some churches would have been more strongly Catholic. Some churches, when you went into them, would have been more strongly Protestant. It depended on who the priest was, the vicar who was running that church. So there was quite a variety inside it, and it aimed to catch as much of the middle area as possible. If Catholics would only compromise a little bit, please find your spiritual satisfaction in the Church of England. If Protestants of the extreme kind that would tend to be, well, they were mostly called Puritans in those days, the Puritans had a more strongly Protestant view. Again, please compromise and just a little bit and see if you can fit yourself into this Church of England. At any rate, everybody was forced to go to church. If they didn't go to church, they would have to pay a fine. So she brought people into the middle area, trying to reconcile Catholics and the more extreme Protestants, the Puritans, through her Eikokukyokai, her Church of England, or the Anglican Church, as it came to be known. So if we look across the 16th century, let's go back on that. This is what we've got. It starts off as a Catholic country. It becomes a kind of neutral country when Henry divorces. It moves over again into being quite strongly Protestant country before going straight back to Catholicism, and then again moves into an area that's closer to the Protestant churches. So it's a kind of pendulum swinging across the 16th century like this. Okay? Well, Shakespeare was born in Elizabeth's period, and so in a sense this was a fairly stable time because all of these things had been happening before he was born. So the consequences of those unstable times were still very much there in Elizabethan England. There was still a big tension between Catholics and Protestants. The church was supposedly somewhere in the middle, but the Catholic and Protestant tension was very, very strong. There were still many people who would prefer to go back to the Catholic faith, and there was others who wanted an even stronger form of Protestantism, as I say, the Puritans. So this leads us to what we now call the Long Reformation. Now, they used to talk about the Reformation as being something that happened, more or less, when Henry changed the church and split away from the Pope. That was the Reformation. But it wasn't really. In many ways, Henry's England was still very similar to Catholic England. The religion was basically very similar to the Catholic religion. It's just that they didn't follow the Pope. But in the last 20 years or so, we've started to see that the Reformation was something much more than that. It went on for a long time. And its roots were back in the 14th century. And its effects and developments lasted right into the 18th century. So we can really talk about a long Reformation, a slow Reformation. All right? And Shakespeare would be somewhere inside that, at a very important point inside that. So we need to understand the idea that really it's not so simple as to say that the English had become Protestant under Henry and had suffered the return to Catholicism under Mary and then happily went back to Protestantism under Elizabeth. There was a lot of resistance to the Elizabethan settlement, and it wasn't the end of Catholicism in England at all. There were many Catholics. We call them some of them were what we call recusants. That means they openly refused to cooperate, and they were persecuted, they were fined, they were put in prison. In extreme cases, they were put to death. But there were also many what are called church papists. They said, okay, we'll shut up, we'll go to the church, but we, in our hearts, don't really believe this. So on the one hand, you had these Catholics, and on the other hand, you had Puritans who were saying, well, we wish that England was more strongly Protestant than it is. So it wasn't the end of Catholicism by any means when the Elizabethan settlement was made. It was actually the beginning of a long struggle. So there's a lot of recent scholarship showing that Catholic literature and culture played a pretty big part in Catholic times. So because of that, it's pretty reasonable to suppose that Shakespeare would have been exposed to Catholic influences, because there were so many Catholic influences around. Other Elizabethans would have been exposed to them as well. It was just part of what was going on. Shakespeare's grandparents would have lived through the period when Henry broke with Rome. So they would have been Catholics, of course, because everybody was at that time. And the Church of England stayed, as I've said, basically Catholic in its teaching right through until Henry's death. And most people saw themselves as kind of, well, we're Catholics. It's just that, our king has had a bit of a kinker, a bit of a quarrel with the Pope. But we're basically Catholics, really. And England had only really been Protestant during those years when Edward, Henry's son, had been king for a few years before Mary, his sister, you remember, took the church back to Catholicism. So at the time that Shakespeare was born, Catholicism was still very much around. It was very much part of what was going on in Elizabethan England. So did Shakespeare have Catholic connections? Well, of course he did. He was an Elizabethan. Pretty much every Elizabethan would have had Catholic connections. If we look at it like this, we can say, all right, his mother, Mary Arden, she came from a strongly Catholic family. All right? And when Shakespeare was just 19, his cousin Edward Arden had his head cut off because he gave refuge to a Catholic priest. So the Arden family continued to have strong Catholic ideas and strongly believing in Catholicism. Another thing that would be a Catholic connection for Shakespeare would be his hometown, Stratford, where he lived. It was a strongly Catholic area. And it's possible that Shakespeare even went as a young man to Lancaster in the north of England, which was even more strongly Catholic, and that he lived for a while with a Catholic family in that area. This would strongly, if this was true, we can't be sure, but if that was true, it would strongly support the idea that Shakespeare himself was one of those secret Catholics, one of those church papists. And then his school, well, he went to King's New School, which produced many Catholics among its students and also had Catholic schoolmasters. So his first teacher became a Jesuit in 1575. His fellow student, Robert Debdale, became a Catholic priest in 1586. So there are these kinds of things. Another important piece of evidence, if it's true, again, because we're not quite sure, is his father's will, which was pretty clearly a Catholic document. It was only discovered in 1757 and it was later destroyed by fire, so we don't really know exactly about his father's will, but if it was genuine, then that would be another strong reason for suggesting that perhaps Shakespeare had Catholic sympathies, or that he actually was a church papist, a secret papist, secretly a Catholic. And his wedding, well, it took place in a church whose vicar was supposedly, again, secretly supporting the Catholics, John Frith. So this is just one more connection with Catholicism. And his father and his daughter were both fined for recusancy. That's those people who refused to attend church, which was very often the reason for refusing to attend church was because the person was strongly a Catholic and said, "I'm sorry, I cannot go into your church because it is not my church. I don't believe in your faith." So again, this would support the idea that perhaps Shakespeare was himself in favour of Catholic ideas. And we have his own works, what Shakespeare himself wrote. It was recognised by Empson, who was a scholar, one of the most famous scholars of my college, actually, Magdalen, who noticed that Shakespeare had written about bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang in one of his sonnets, and realized that Shakespeare must be talking about the ruins of the monasteries where until recently sweet birds, that is the monks or the nuns, were singing the sweet songs of religion, but now they have been turned into ruins. And yes, certainly, that was very much what was going on in England at that time. These are some of the ruins of the monasteries that Henry VIII closed, and they're still standing, many of them today. We can still see some of these. Actually, I made a mistake there. That one in the middle, that's not actually in England, I'm sorry. Most of these are English, and yes, okay, so these are, yeah, that one in the middle, I'm sorry about that. It's not actually an English monastery. You can see that the style is completely different. So, but this was something that was going on in other countries that had turned to Protestantism as well. The monasteries were being closed. So, another point at which Shakespeare says something similar is in Henry VIII, in the prologue. He says, "Those that can pity here may, if they think it well, let forth a tear," which would be, again, indicating that people who cared about the church and what had happened might actually cry when they thought about those ruined monasteries and the old faith of the Catholics that had been destroyed in England and replaced by the Church of England. All right. Shakespeare and Robert Parsons. Now, Robert Parsons was a Jesuit. He was a Catholic priest. And again, if we can see any kind of relationship between Robert Parsons and Shakespeare, that sort of also suggests that there's some kind of connection between Shakespeare and Catholicism. All right, so let's see what we've got. Well, Shakespeare actually does refer to Parsons directly. He mentions him in Love's Labour's Lost and in Twelfth Night. And you can find several echoes of Parsons' famous book, A Christian Directory, in a number of Shakespeare's plays, including Hamlet. So it's pretty clear that Shakespeare had actually read Parsons' work. All right. So here's Shakespeare reading the work of a Jesuit, a Catholic priest. And Parsons also refers to Shakespeare because he talks about John Oldcastle, a historical figure. I mean, John Oldcastle really existed, and he's described as a ruffian knight, as all England knoweth, and commonly brought on by comedians on their stages. Well, Oldcastle was the basis for a character called Falstaff in 3 of Shakespeare's plays. So commonly brought on by comedians on their stages means people like Shakespeare used John Oldcastle in their plays. And it's true, Shakespeare did. So here we have not only Shakespeare referring to the Jesuit priest, but we have the Jesuit priest referring to Shakespeare. And another person of the time, the mapmaker and historian John Speed, he also comments on how Parsons mentions Oldcastle, and he attacks Parsons and his poet. He says, this papist and his poet, meaning Parsons and Shakespeare. He says they are of like conscience for lies. They are basically similar to each other. The one ever feigning and the other ever falsifying the truth. He's calling them both basically liars, and he's suggesting that they are very similar to each other in a way. The implication would be that they are both Catholics. Okay, so am I saying then that Shakespeare was a Catholic? Well, I'm saying certainly that there are, not just the connections between Shakespeare and Catholicism that I've pointed out so far, but other connections too. You can find many traces in Shakespeare's works of the influence of Robert Southwell, who was a very famous Catholic poet who was put to death for his religion. And there's a fairly good possibility that, again, Southwell was dedicating one of his works to Shakespeare. So, again, quite a strong connection. And there are plenty of associations between Shakespeare and Catholicism. So, am I suggesting that Shakespeare was a Catholic? Well, probably not. I think it's too much to say that he was a Catholic, at least in the sense that he was openly a Catholic, because clearly that's not true. So it is possible, of course, that he was secretly a Catholic. It's possible that he had Catholic sympathies. And there are quite a lot of fairly respected scholars who will argue that. And one of them is, of course, a very famous professor of this university, of Sophia University, Peter Millward, who is still living at the time that I'm speaking in S.J. House, here on the campus. On the other hand, we do know that Shakespeare outwardly conformed to the Church of England. He did not stick out as a recusant who refused to go to church or anything like that. And also, of course, England had only fairly recently changed from being basically a Catholic country. So as I said before, most Elizabethans would have had Catholic connections. Queen Elizabeth's father was a Catholic, basically, until he had his quarrel with the Pope. Her sister was a strict Catholic, and so was her cousin. All right. Even Mary herself had accepted Catholicism, or at least she said she accepted Catholicism during the time that her sister was queen. So that kind of situation would be true for a lot of people. We can't really argue from that kind of Catholic connection that a person was or was not Catholic, because those kinds of connections would have been typical. More or less everybody in the Elizabethan period would have had Catholic parents or Catholic members of the family somewhere or other, certainly Catholic neighbours and so on, or people whose parents and grandparents had been Catholic. This was inevitable. This was because England was going through the process of changing from being a basically Catholic country to being a Protestant one. Okay, so in conclusion then, basically we can't really know what was going on inside Shakespeare's head or inside his heart. Queen Elizabeth basically accepted that we can't look into people's hearts in that way, and we have no right to. That what people believe is their own business. All she asked was that people conform outwardly, that they go to church and show that they, at least in terms of their social behaviour and their outward acts, that they supported the church. So it's possible that Shakespeare was one of those people who went to church but didn't really believe it. We can't really say. And it's also true that a lot of people at that time would have been suffering a kind of crisis about what they should believe and what was the right path, and that people at different stages in their life might have felt differently about this. So it's very open to question what Shakespeare himself really believed. And of course, he writes about religion, he talks about religion, very often in an indirect kind of way, by raising themes such as revenge, which was a religious question, because revenge is mine, saith the Lord, is a strong message in the Bible, and people are urged not to take revenge. But he, of course, writes about revenge in plays like Hamlet or The Merchant of Venice and so on. So Shakespeare raises these questions that were important in religion, and they mattered obviously to him just as they mattered to other people in those days. So this was an age of masking, an age when people very often kept their innermost thoughts to themselves. It could be dangerous to express certain ideas, and so Shakespeare, like many people in those days, may have been keeping something hidden, or he may not have particularly had any strong beliefs at all. We don't really know. Okay, we'll never really know. Okay, and perhaps, as I say, he didn't even know himself. There were so many confusions and so many crises of belief at that time that a lot of people would have been unsure where, in the end, they should put their faith. So, in many ways, for me, this is the strength of Shakespeare, that what he does is not to express with certainty that something is particularly true. The point is that he encourages people to think. He raises the questions, he debates the issues. In fact, I would argue that the Bible itself does that, so that perhaps the power of literature is not that it gives certain answers, but that it provokes certain questions and encourages people to think about them. So I'm going to leave it at that and say we don't know whether Shakespeare was a Catholic or not, but we do certainly know that he wrote frequently about topics that were related to religious issues, including Catholicism. That's it.